Hi, everyone, and welcome to January's PHDV Policy Committee webinar series. Today, Andrea McLean will be speaking to us about a proposed regulation for new no net loss wetland benefits approach in Manitoba. Andrea, thank you for agreeing to do the presentation today. You're welcome to start whenever you're ready.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much. I'm going to be presenting on what the Manitoba government is currently consulting on today, and it incorporates a new streamlined and balanced approach to drainage and water retention in Manitoba that incorporates a no net loss for prescribed wetlands, which we've outlined in a new amendment to the Act. So the Water Rights Act was initially established in 1988, and it is the act that governs all drainage and water retention regulation and licensing within Manitoba. So the act itself states that no person shall control works or construct, establish, or maintain any water control works unless he or she has a valid and subsisting license to do so. So as it currently sits, the proponent submits an application to do any drainage works or water retention works with a $25 fee. The department reviews and assesses each application individually. Project sites are inspected by the water resource officers, and then the licenses are either issued or denied. Or in some cases, they'll have conditions put on them in order for those projects to be licensed. So if the license is issued, then the applicant can proceed with the construction of the project. So with this detailed review of each specific project, Manitoba has encountered a backlog of applications for water control works and the approval as such. So in efforts to try and streamline that process, the government came out with the Sustainable Watersheds Act in June of 2018. In June of 2018 it was passed. So this supports a new streamlined and strengthened provincial drainage regulatory regime and modernizes inspection enforcement tools within the province. So the expected outcomes of the amendments made to the Water Rights Act. So the Sustainable Watersheds Act amended 4 pieces of legislation, one of which included the Water Rights Act. So the outcomes of this new approach within the Water Rights Act are aimed at streamlining application and approvals, providing consistent regulatory regimes for drainage and water control works, as well as compensation for wetland loss or alteration, a reduction of red tape for lower risk and lower impact projects, increased flexibility of requirements for downstream landowner approvals, and finally to provide some stronger linkages between watershed plans that are completed within the province and land use decision making. So right now, as I said, we're out for consultation on a proposed regulation. The proposed regulation sets out in detail how the amendments to the Act will come into force. And the highlights of the proposed regulation that I'm going to go through today are the exemptions to the Water Rights Act, a new registration process for projects and fees, the current licensing process and projects and fees, landowner approvals, and then finally the wetland mitigation and compensation portion. So we've never used the regulatory power to exempt works from authorizations, and under the proposed regulation we're proposing to use that regulatory power. So there's 3 types of projects that won't require authorization if this regulation is put forward and passed. And those include same for same culvert replacement. So there's no change in size to the culvert or the invert elevation. Another set of projects that would be exempt were any projects that require a license under an Environment Act process. So that's aiming at harmonizing the Environment Act licensing process and the Water Rights Act licensing process. So an example of that would be a small dam over 40 acre-feet that has permanent storage, would normally require an Environment Act license and currently would also require a Water Rights Act license. If this proposed regulation went forward, it would just go under the Environment Act licensing process. And then finally, the final exemption is to formalize a current policy that we have where works within an urban area that do not outlet to an outlying rural area don't require a license. However, if this is put forward and passed, then we would have the additional requirement that the proposed works couldn't result in the loss or alteration of a class 3, 4, or 5 wetland, which I'll get into in a bit, the rationale behind that. So we also have a new registration process, and this is designed to take those lower risk, lower impact projects off of the water resource officer's desk and streamline the approvals within a 14-day period. So the legislation for the Water Rights Act amendments resulted in this new registration process and the ability to classify different types of works that were lower risk, lower impact. So we've put forward some 6 classes, and those include minor surface drain construction, agricultural subsurface tile drain construction, water control works for new crossings, minor culvert changes, wetland enhancement and restoration, and small dam construction. So there's a number of additional requirements under each of these classes of works, and those have to be met within the application process. In addition, our current fee of $25 for the applications doesn't reflect the amount of work that the officers are doing to review each of these projects. So we're proposing to update the fees, and that would include an application fee for the registration side of $100 and the traditional licensing side. So any project that doesn't fit within the registerable classes would still be able to proceed through the traditional licensing process. And that would have an application fee of $500. And that is likely where you would see the compensation if wetland compensation was triggered. So there are certain guidelines that don't allow projects to be eligible for registration, regardless of whether they meet the requirements in the classes of works. And those include projects that result in the loss or alteration of a class 3, 4, or 5 wetland. Any project that results in the drainage of class 6 or 7 or unimproved organic soils. If the project is proposing to transfer water between watersheds. If the project will result in negative impacts on fish spawning, rearing, or fish passage. And that is in there and likely not even able to go through the traditional licensing process because it would trigger the Environment Act license. So it would actually go through that process. A project can't be registered if it's inconsistent with an approved watershed plan as outlined in the Water Protection Act, and then also if it violated a conservation agreement restriction. So as I said before, there's 6 classes of registerable works. Each one has a definition underneath it and parameters which make it registerable. And then there's also additional requirements that the applicant would have to provide up front in order to provide confidence that the project is a lower risk, lower impact project. So I'll quickly go through these. Class A is a minor surface drain construction. So that's a construction of surface drains with a depth not exceeding 12 inches below natural prairie level. Class B is agricultural subsurface tile drainage construction. So that's the construction of subsurface tile drains with a drainage coefficient equal to or less than 3/8 of an inch over a 24-hour period. Some additional requirements for these types of projects include the design by a tile drainage installer that has taken an approved course. The project cannot be located within 50 meters of a prescribed wetland, so that's the class 3, 4, or 5 wetlands. And then additional design information included in that. So class C is new access crossings, so that's the construction of driveways or access crossings to fields that don't restrict flow on the natural path. And that additional requirements would be just demonstrating what the upstream and downstream culvert sizes were, and then the culvert size requirement is outlined there and can't restrict flow. So class D is the minor culvert changes. So this is where there is an existing culvert that wants, or that a municipality or an entity wants to increase or decrease its hydraulic capacity. If the hydraulic capacity isn't increased or decreased by more than 15%, then it would be eligible for registration. So class E is the wetland enhancement and restoration class. This is works that restore a wetland that has previously been drained or increases the size of an existing wetland. The plug can't be more than 1 meter in height, and the project can't retain more than 25 acre-feet in order to be registerable. There's some additional requirements under this class also, one of which includes additional landowner approvals. So the project would need landowner approvals from anybody who might be flooded by the project, or anybody who might see a downstream reduction in flow as a result of the plug. So class F is small dam construction. So that's the construction of dams less than 2.5 meters in height and that retain less than 25 acre-feet of water. And again, there are additional requirements, some of which include design plan by a professional engineer or other certified agent. So that's a certified engineering technologist or technician. It has to demonstrate that the dam won't exceed 1 in 100 year, or will accommodate a 1 in 100 year flood event. And then similar landowner approvals to the wetland enhancement and restoration class. So even though a project might not meet the requirements within the registration, it doesn't mean that those projects can't be approved. However, it would just mean that those projects would have to go through the different streams. So here's an example on a culvert upgrade where a culvert upgrade project could be registerable, meeting the requirements, and if so, the project can be registered, and the applicant would receive a registration certificate within 14 days. If the requirements for the registerable classes aren't met, it would go through the traditional licensing process. And we're anticipating through that process that we'll have shorter wait times as those lower risk, lower impact projects are fast tracked through the registration process. So one of the other issues we've been dealing with in Manitoba is downstream approvals and the ability for downstream landowners to veto projects based on unmerited reasons. So the proposed regulation would require through the registration process the approval from the applicable municipality or local authority. And then we've built in some flexibility on the downstream landowner approval, where they would require the immediate downstream landowner approval for the project. And if they can't get that, then they could get a written exemption from an officer who confirmed that the downstream landowner wouldn't be affected by the project. So similarly, in the licensing process, the applicable municipality would have to sign off on the project. And then also the water resource officer, because they're spending more time on these higher risk, higher impact projects, they would determine which landowners needed to sign off on the project to be and were significantly affected. So we have the registration piece to streamline the approval process in Manitoba as one of the pieces in the Sustainable Watersheds Act and the amendments to the Water Rights Act. The other piece, main piece, is the no net loss of wetland benefit approach. So there's a new provision that sets a requirement to restore wetland benefits where a licensee is authorized to drain a prescribed class of wetland. So the requirements to compensate for the prescribed wetland drainage is outlined in the proposed regulation and has to be outlined in the regulation. And the amount of offset required is likely to vary depending on the type of restoration or enhancement work done. This approach is based on the mitigation hierarchy of avoidance and minimization and compensation. However, within the regulation, we've only outlined the compensation piece because that actually has a financial implication to it, so we had to do it within regulation. The avoidance and minimization piece we are going to put under policy. So the proposed regulation outlines prescribed wetlands as class 3, 4, and 5 wetlands. Those are the more permanent wetlands within Manitoba. And this will therefore require compensation if they result in the loss or alteration of these wetlands. There's 4 methods of compensation outlined within the regulation. In the legislation, it talks about restoration and enhancement, and in the regulation, we further defined what restoration and enhancement mean. So restoration is the restoration of a previously existing wetland. Enhancement can be 3 things. It could be increasing the size of an existing wetland. It could be improving the benefits associated with the wetland, so that includes the upland habitat. But it has to also be coupled with providing permanent legal protection of that associated wetland habitat. And then finally, providing permanent legal protection of an existing wetland. So the ratios indicated here when figuring out compensation are based on surface area of the wetland. And there's 3 types of ratios that are associated to each of those definitions or compensation methods. So if a proponent is proposing to drain a class 3, 4, or 5, and they want to restore or enlarge an existing wetland, the ratio would be a 2-to-1. If they're proposing to enhance an existing wetland and include the upland habitat improvement, then that would be a 3-to-1 ratio. Again, that's tied with permanent legal protection of that area. And then finally, the permanent legal protection of an existing wetland would be a 3-to-1 ratio. So the mitigation process, like I said, we're committed to a mitigation hierarchy, but the regulation only requires that we outline the compensation process in regulation because of its financial component. So if a proponent wishes to proceed with a project that impacts a class 3, 4, or 5 wetland, the compensation process will follow, and the applicant seeks a license to drain the wetland. The officer would go out and inspect the wetland to confirm the size and classification. And then the landowner has 3 options to choose from, or they can also choose not to proceed with the project. So they can pay, purchase, or perform under the compensation process. So in the payment option, this is really the quick option where a landowner just chooses that they want to just make a payment and get their license to drain the wetland. So this, the applicant can pay an approved organization to restore or enhance wetland benefits based on the surface area of the lost or altered wetlands. So the payment is calculated by the area of wetland impacted by the ratio of 2 times a $6,000 per acre payment. So here in the example, we have a 2-acre class 3 wetland. That was the required payment if the proponent chose the payment option would be $24,000. Under the purchase option, so this is the purchasing or the negotiation with an approved organization, where we enter into an agreement with these organizations to do this work on the landscape. So the proponent could go into an approved organization, and really this is the negotiated price option, where one of these organizations could pull a project off the shelf and say, yes, I can do this restoration work for you that meets your requirements, and it'll result in a lower payment option than the pay option. So the required compensation still has to meet all of the ratios as outlined before and the 4 methods. But really the service provider here, or that organization, is doing the work, able to do the work ahead of time too. So there's the ability for these organizations to do the almost a wetland restoration, enhancement, preservation on spec ahead of time, and then be paid for it later. So the final option is the perform a wetland restoration, enhancement, or protection, and this is really the do-it-yourself option. So if a proponent wanted to follow the regulation methods and compensation ratios, they're able to do the works themselves, the compensation works themselves. And this actually triggers an additional step where the proponent would have to do the work upfront first prior to getting their license to do the drainage work. So the director also has to approve of the proposal. The officer would go out and inspect and make sure the restoration or enhancement project was complete as outlined in the approved proposal, and then the proponent would get their license to have their drainage works completed. So our next steps, like I've said, we're out for a public consultation period of 45 days ending January 19th. After we get all those comments in, we'll be summarizing them and assessing the comments. We're hoping to have the regulations finalized and registered, and as a result proclaiming the rest of the amendments to the Water Rights Act for this spring season. I've included the consultation website links, and maybe we can send them out by email afterwards. I've also included the direct link to a plain language summary, which basically goes through the information I've presented here today, and then also the direct link to the legal text of the regulation. And that's it. Questions?
Thank you, Andrea. And please type any questions you have in the chat box. Andrea,
Yes.
we had a question come in. What happens if a landowner beyond the adjacent neighbor experience significant impacts from a registered project?
So the way we've outlined the registered projects is we have confidence that they won't in most cases do that. If for some reason they do, then we can always amend the conditions of our license to address those concerns. And then we have
another question came through. Can a landowner replace an acre of class 3, 4, or 5 wetland with 2 acres of class 1 or 2?
Currently, as the regulation, I'd have to reference the legal text, but it might be so, and that might just be a bit of an error in us working with the legal team. But the intent was that it would be, if you're restoring with a class 2 acres of class 1 or 2, then there would be a requirement of permanent legal protection on that piece.
Okay. Another question here. Is there any specifics on where the revenues collected via payments purchase options would be allocated? Asking about general revenues.
Yeah. So that actually, the payments and revenue doesn't come to the province. It's outlined in the amendments to the Water Rights Act that we would enter into an agreement with an organization to do that on the behalf. There is also within the legislation reporting requirements to us and what we outline in those agreements to ensure that we're meeting the requirements of the legislation.
Great. Another question. What is defined as permanent protection?
A conservation agreement or legal protection on that wetland. So it's permanent legal protection in perpetuity.
And one more question I see here. Is the process for only new development or all existing drainage? How will current flooding impacts of existing drainage work be addressed?
So I'll tackle the first one. So is the process only for new development? It depends. It's only for new licenses or new approvals on works that require a license. So there might be existing works out there that are currently unlicensed, and we deal with that right now where we try to bring them into compliance when we find out about them. So that'll be a similar process. If there are current flooding impacts on existing drainage works, again, if they're licensed, we can amend the conditions to try and address the flooding concerns that way. And if they are unlicensed, like I said, we try and bring them into compliance.
Great. Thank you. That appears to be all the questions we have. One more just came in. Will existing works be required to compensate for wetland loss?
So existing licenses that are out there for drainage of class 3, 4, and 5 wetlands won't require compensation because they've already received the approval.
Okay. In the current system, do absolutely all activities that affect water flow and all classes of wetlands require approvals? And what is the backlog time?
Oh, that's a tough one. Yeah, any project that affects water flow requires approval right now. The backlog time can vary depending on the location, the volume coming in, depending on the watershed. So really, can range from an approval process of 4 weeks to a longer process where some municipalities are waiting, or some proponents are waiting longer than that, 6 months.
Okay. Is there any form of an environmental assessment of class 3, 4, and 5 wetlands being drained? I.e., is there a situation where a wetland couldn't be drained?
As the regulation is currently written, no. So if a proponent was willing to meet the compensation requirements, then they could proceed with the project. I will say, though, that there's other pieces of legislation that do protect significant wetlands in Manitoba, and that's, if they're within a wildlife management area, or they're protected by another piece of legislation, then that would precede this.
Okay, one more question. Early in the presentation, there was a mention of protection of wetlands in urban areas. Can you explain further?
Yeah, so that would mean that so within the urban areas, currently they don't have to come to the province for approval of projects unless they're outletting to the outlying rural areas. What we're adding to that is also unless they're impacting a class 3, 4, or 5 wetland. So just because the works within the urban area don't affect an outlying rural area, but they do impact a 3, 4, or 5, they still have to compensate for that as any proponent would in the rural area.
Okay, where would permanent protection of the wetlands be registered?
Permanent legal protection in Manitoba is governed under the Conservation Agreements Act.
Is there like a registry that somebody can go to look that up, or?
I'm not sure. I think that would be, I actually don't know if there's a public registry, but there are agencies that are able to do that, like Manitoba Habitat Heritage, Ducks Unlimited Canada. So it would be probably an internal or an agreement between the organizations to share that information so that when we're reviewing projects we can see whether they have a conservation agreement on them or not.
Okay. Has there been any progress in funding for an overall ALICE type program that would enhance environmental goods and services?
So the ALICE type program is called GROW, or Growing Outcomes in Watersheds. Currently we're working on a watershed-based approach to water management in Manitoba. And in August 2017, we came out with a consultation piece on this watershed policy framework. With that, it includes the drainage regulations. It includes a modernization of the current conservation district program to change their names to watershed districts and move them to watershed boundaries. And then also the GROW program, which is the ALICE-like type program that we would try and put forward in Manitoba. So currently we've been focusing on the drainage regulations, solidifying what those will be, and then also moving the conservation districts to the watershed districts and to the watershed-based boundaries. So I think coming in the next year or so, we'll be working on that ALICE type programming.
There's one more. If there was an existing drain class 3 wetland from which drainage works did not have an approval, would mitigation be required when they apply for approval?
I think that type of stipulation or situation isn't currently outlined in the regulation and would likely be developed in policy.
Okay. Sure with the... Are there any penalties for draining without approval?
Yeah, in the amendments to the Act, we updated the enforcement fees and fines. I think they were up to $50,000 now for a fine. In the case of an individual, and if it's a corporation, it's up to $500,000. In most cases, we try and work with the proponent to try and either bring the project into compliance so they can get a license for it, or we'll work with them to close it. But often there are cases where we have to go to court on those, and that's where the penalties and fines would come into play.
Okay. What organizations are allowed to restore or create wetlands in lieu of payment?
So the payment option will likely initially be one organization that will enter into an agreement with to act as a bank. That money coming in for the payment option would be eligible for conservation agencies who normally work in the conservation, restoration, preservation realm of wetlands to apply for funding to do that work on behalf of that fund. In the approved service providers, again, those conservation agencies that normally do this work or have expertise in this work could enter into an agreement with the province on that. We haven't specifically named those, and that'll be something that we'll be looking forward to once we have the regulation in place.
Okay. How does protection of other wetlands as compensation meet no net loss?
So the idea is that those class 3, 4, and 5 wetlands, even though they're essentially, they require compensation, we do recognize that an existing wetland in its natural state provides more benefits than a compensated wetland and a drained natural wetland. So the idea behind providing permanent legal protection for those wetlands enshrines that those wetlands cannot be drained going forward. So in the example, there's a conservation agreement on a class 3 wetland. That wetland can't be drained even if the proponent is willing to do the compensation for it.
Okay, thank you. Is there any grandfathering in the current or proposed system?
I think in the sense there's grandfathering on anything that's already been approved. Okay. So if there's a license out there for a works, they already have the license, and we're not redoing licenses. This is regulation that'll be going forward. If it's a project that happens without approval, then it's going to be a situational based decision.
Okay. What percentage of existing works have approvals?
I'm not totally sure. We've been asked this before, and we really don't know what we don't know. So I'm not sure how to answer that. In Manitoba, since the Act has been around since the 80s, proponents generally have an idea that there is a requirement for them to do these works. If there is, and if not, there are downstream landowners that know their rights as well. So generally, if there's a project that happens that has significant impact, we will more than likely find out.
Okay. How do you determine if a wetland is at risk before entering into a conservation agreement? In other words, is there any likelihood of issuing credit for protecting wetlands that will never be at risk?
I think that's something we're going to have to develop within the agreement in the policy. It's not really included in the existing regulation, or the proposed regulation, I should say.
If there are no other questions right now, we'll go ahead and thank you, Andrea, for today's presentation. If you do have questions, please feel free to get a hold of us, and we'll pass them along to Andrea. Thank you, everybody, for attending today's presentation, and thank you, Andrea.
Hey, thank you so much. And like I said before, our consultation period is out there, so we're looking at comments. And I'd love to hear from other provinces on lessons learned.
Great. Just so everybody knows, the presentation will be made available on the PHJV YouTube site. All of the presentations get parked there. It should be up in the next day or so. Again, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and we'll see you again next month.
Okay, thank you.